My brother's plot to get my share backfired, and the family ended up more divided than ever, and it all started when Dad called a family meeting after Sunday dinner. Family meetings weren't unusual for us. Dad always believed in transparency when it came to big decisions. But this one felt different. Mom was unusually quiet, her hands clasped tightly on the table, while Dad's expression was uncharacteristically somber. "Kids," Dad began, his voice steady but firm, "your mom and I have finalized our estate plan. We wanted to sit down and talk to you face to face, so there aren't any misunderstandings later." Avery, my older brother, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "This should be good," he muttered under his breath. Mom shot him a disapproving look, but he didn't flinch. Sophia, the youngest of us, sat to my left, nervously picking at her fingernails. Dad sighed and looked at each of us in turn. "Here's how it's going to work. Hunter, you'll inherit the majority of the family business. Avery, you'll receive the lake house and the rental properties. Sophia, the trust fund your mother and I set up will be yours." It took a second for the words to sink in. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I definitely didn't expect that. The business? Me? I glanced at Avery and immediately regretted it. His face was a storm cloud, jaw clenched, eyes burning with anger. "The business?" Avery said, his voice sharp. "Dad, I've been working in the company longer than Hunter. Hell, I was there when it was struggling to stay afloat." "I know that," Dad said, his tone calm but firm, "and I appreciate everything you've done. But Hunter's the one who's turned it around these last few years. He's shown leadership, dedication, and I haven't." Avery snapped. "Avery," Mom interjected softly, "this isn't about you. This is about what's best for the future." Avery's laugh was bitter. "Right. Of course. Because Hunter's always been the golden boy, hasn't he?" "That's enough," Dad said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't up for debate. The decision is final." The tension in the room was suffocating. I wanted to say something, anything, to defuse the situation, but I was too stunned to speak. Avery pushed back his chair abruptly, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "Fine," he said coldly. "If that's how it's going to be, then fine." He stormed out of the room, leaving the rest of us sitting there in awkward silence. Mom looked like she was on the verge of tears, while Sophia just stared at her plate, her cheeks flushed. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the scene over and over in my head. Avery's reaction wasn't surprising. He'd always been competitive, always felt like he had something to prove. But this time, it felt different. There was a venom in his voice I hadn't heard before, a fury that sent a chill down my spine. The first sign that something was wrong came a week later. I was at the office, working on some quarterly reports, when Sophia called me out of the blue. "Hey," she said, her voice tense. "Are you home?" "No, I'm at work," I said. "Why?" "It's Avery," she said. "He's been weird ever since the meeting. I overheard him talking to Mia last night. He kept saying something about a lawyer." "A lawyer?" My stomach sank. "Soph, he's probably just venting. You know how he is. He's upset." "No," she said firmly. "This wasn't venting. It sounded like he was planning something. Something big." I sighed. "I'll talk to him. Don't worry." But even as I said the words, I felt a knot of unease forming in my chest. Things only got stranger from there. At a family barbecue the following weekend, Avery was almost too friendly, like he was trying to make up for his outburst. It wasn't like him. "Hunter," he said, clapping me on the back as I helped Dad flip burgers. "How's the golden boy doing?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine. You?" "Oh, you know me," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Always busy, always planning." He turned his attention to the grill, but I caught the way his jaw tightened when Dad asked me about a new project at the company. Later, I saw him and Mia whispering in the corner of the yard. They stopped talking the second I walked by, their expressions unreadable. The breaking point came a few days later when Avery invited me to lunch. He rarely asked to spend time with me one-on-one, so I was immediately suspicious. Still, I went, hoping to clear the air. We met at a small cafe downtown, and Avery wasted no time getting to the point. "Look, Hunter," he said, leaning forward. Let's not beat around the bush. You don't actually want the business, do you? What? I said, caught off guard. Of course I do. Why wouldn't I? Come on, he said, his tone sharp. You're not passionate about it. Not like I am. Dad gave it to you because you're his favorite, not because you earned it. The accusation hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, stunned. Avery, that's not true. I've been working my ass off to keep the business afloat. You know that. Sure, he said with a bitter smile. But you're not me. You don't deserve it. My fists clenched under the table, but I forced myself to stay calm. Dad made his decision. If you have a problem with it, take it up with him. Oh, I plan to, he said with a smirk. But don't say I didn't give you a chance to do the right thing first. That night, I couldn't shake the conversation. Sophia's warning echoed in my mind, and I started noticing all the little details I'd missed. Avery's sudden friendliness, the whispered conversations, the lawyer comment. It was all adding up to something, but I didn't know what. The final straw came when I got an email from Jackson, our family lawyer. It was vague, just a request to schedule a meeting about potential estate concerns, but it was enough to confirm my suspicions. Avery wasn't just upset. He was plotting something, and if I wasn't careful, he was going to take everything. The email from Jackson stayed open on my screen for a long time, my eyes scanning the words over and over. Potential estate concerns felt like code for Avery stirring the pot. But what concerned me more was how quickly Jackson had been roped into whatever my brother was planning. I decided not to respond immediately. Instead, I called Sophia. Hey, I said when she picked up. You were right. Avery's up to something. There was a pause on the line before she replied, her voice a mix of vindication and concern. What happened? He's gotten Jackson involved. I got an email about some estate issue. That doesn't make sense, Sophia said, her tone sharpening. What could he even contest? Dad's decision is legally binding, isn't it? Maybe, but knowing Avery, he's found some angle to twist things. Sophia sighed heavily. You need to talk to Dad. This is getting out of hand. I knew she was right, but the thought of dragging Dad into this mess made my stomach turn. He'd already done his part. If Avery couldn't handle it, that was on him. But if he was trying to undermine the entire arrangement, I couldn't just sit back and let it happen. I didn't have to wait long to figure out Avery's next move. The very next day, I walked into the office to find a courier waiting for me with a thick envelope. The return address belonged to Jackson's firm. Inside was a formal letter stating that Avery had filed a legal motion to challenge the validity of Dad's will. The reason? Alleged undue influence. The accusation was absurd. Undue influence? From who? Dad wasn't the type to let anyone push him around, least of all me. But Avery clearly thought he could spin the narrative to his advantage. Fuming, I called Jackson immediately. Hunter, he said when he picked up, his tone carefully neutral. I was expecting your call. What the hell is this? I demanded. Avery's claiming Dad was influenced into giving me the business? That's ridiculous. I understand your frustration, Jackson said calmly. But Avery is within his rights to file a challenge. As the executor of your father's estate, I'm obligated to take his claims seriously. And what happens now? I asked, though I already dreaded the answer. There will be an investigation, Jackson said. Interviews, document reviews, possibly even a court hearing if Avery pushes it that far. I hung up, my blood boiling. This wasn't just about the business anymore. Avery was trying to tear apart everything Dad had worked for, and by dragging the rest of us into his mess, he was putting the entire family on the line. That evening, I finally decided to confront Dad. I drove to my parents' house, rehearsing what I'd say the whole way there. But when I walked through the door, Dad's expression told me he already knew. Let me guess, he said, setting down his coffee cup. Avery. I nodded, sinking into the chair across from him. He's claiming you were influenced into giving me the business. He filed a legal motion. Dad sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. I thought he might pull something like this. You knew? I asked, startled. Your brother's been bitter about the decision since the day I told him, Dad said. But I didn't think he'd take it this far. What do we do? I asked. We don't do anything, Dad said firmly. I made my decision, and I stand by it. If Avery wants to waste his time and money fighting it, that's his choice. But I won't be bullied into changing my mind. His confidence was reassuring, but it didn't erase the knot of anxiety in my chest. Avery wasn't the type to back down, and I had a feeling this was only the beginning. 2 weeks later, things escalated again. I was working late one night when Sophia called me. Her voice panicked. "Hunter, you need to see this," she said. "See what?" "Check your email," she said. "Avery sent something to all of us." I opened my inbox, and there it was, a long, rambling email from Avery outlining his grievances with Dad's decision. But what shocked me the most was how far he was willing to go. He accused me of manipulating Dad, of using my position at the company to influence him into cutting Avery out. "This is insane," I said, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the email. "That's not the worst part," Sophia said. "Did you see what he said about Mom?" I skimmed further down, my heart sinking. Avery had accused Mom of pressuring Dad into favoring me because I was her favorite. It was a low blow, even for him. What is he trying to do? I asked, more to myself than to Sophia. "He's trying to turn everyone against you," she said. "Against all of us. And it's working." Mia's already been calling family members, spreading Avery's version of the story. Mia, of course, she was involved. Avery had always been stubborn, but Mia had a way of pouring gasoline on his worst instincts. I decided I couldn't wait for Avery to make his next move. If he wanted to play dirty, I wasn't going to sit back and let him win. I started digging into his finances, hoping to find something, anything, that would give me leverage. What I found was worse than I expected. Avery had taken out several large loans over the past year, most of which were still unpaid. And a quick conversation with a mutual acquaintance revealed that he and Mia were drowning in debt. It all started to make sense. This wasn't just about the business. Avery needed money, and he was desperate enough to tear the family apart to get it. I called Sophia to tell her what I'd found. "I knew it," she said. "He's not just angry, Hunter. He's desperate. Desperate enough to try anything," I said grimly. "Then you need to be careful," she warned. "Because if he's willing to go this far, who knows what he'll do next?" She was right. Avery wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, or until I stopped him. The revelation about Avery's financial troubles changed everything. This wasn't just about Dad's decision anymore. It was about survival for Avery and Mia. They weren't just angry or bitter. They were desperate. And desperate people were dangerous. I didn't have to wait long to see just how far Avery was willing to go. A few days after uncovering his debt, I received a formal letter from his lawyer. Avery wasn't just challenging the will. He was accusing me of financial misconduct. Specifically, he claimed I had been using the company's funds to influence Dad's decision. It was ridiculous, of course. I'd kept the company's finances clean, squeaky clean. But the accusation alone was enough to raise questions, and questions meant scrutiny. Avery was trying to tarnish my reputation, to make me look unworthy of the role Dad had entrusted to me. I called Sophia as soon as I read the letter. "He's accusing you of what?" she said, her voice rising with disbelief. "Misconduct," I said bitterly. "Basically, he's trying to paint me as corrupt." "That's insane," she said. "Everyone knows you've been keeping the business afloat. Why would you risk everything for? What? A bigger share?" "It's not about logic, Soph," I said. "It's about creating doubt. If he can make me look bad enough, maybe he thinks he can get a judge to side with him." "Have you told Dad?" she asked. "Not yet," I admitted. "I don't want to drag him into this more than he already is." "You might not have a choice," she said. "This is getting out of control." That night, I decided to take a closer look at Mia's role in all of this. Something about her had always rubbed me the wrong way, and now I had a reason to dig deeper. I reached out to Emma, one of my closest friends from college and a private investigator by trade. "Can you look into someone for me?" I asked her. "Who's the target?" She replied, her voice full of intrigue. "Mia," I said, "Avery's girlfriend. I need to know what she's up to, who she's working with, where her money's coming from, everything." Emma didn't ask for details. She just said, "Give me a couple of days," and hung up. Meanwhile, Avery was busy rallying the rest of the family to his side. Over the next week, I started hearing whispers. Relatives who had always been neutral suddenly questioning my character. Longtime family friends avoiding eye contact when I passed them in town. Sophia called me one afternoon, her voice tight with anger. "Aunt Karen just called me," she said. "She told me Avery's been telling people you manipulated Dad into cutting him out." "What?" I said, stunned. "She said Avery's claiming you've been scheming for years, playing the loyal son, making Dad think you're the only one who cares about the business." "That's insane," I said, my chest tightening. "I know," she said, "but the way he's spinning it, it sounds convincing. He's even got Mia talking about how she overheard you and Dad strategizing about the will." The nerve of it all made my blood boil. Avery wasn't just twisting the truth. He was fabricating an entire narrative, and somehow people were buying it. A few days later, Emma called me back. "I've got something," she said, "and you're not going to like it." "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. "Mia's got a history," she said. "She's been involved in at least 2 other lawsuits involving family disputes, both times as the girlfriend of someone trying to get a bigger inheritance." "What?" I said, stunned. "It gets worse," Emma continued. "In one of those cases, her boyfriend ended up bankrupt after losing the case. She stuck around just long enough to collect a payout from the settlement before disappearing." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Mia wasn't just manipulative, she was a professional. And now she had her claws in Avery. "Does he know?" I asked. "Hard to say," Emma replied. "But if I had to guess, probably not. Guys like Avery don't see what's right in front of them until it's too late." Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to confront Avery directly. I called him and told him we needed to talk. Surprisingly, he agreed, though his tone was laced with suspicion. We met at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. As soon as he sat down, I got straight to the point. "Avery, I know about Mia," I said. His expression darkened. "What about her?" "She's done this before," I said. "Twice, in fact. She gets involved with guys in inheritance disputes, stirs the pot, and then bails when things fall apart." "That's bullshit," he snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I have proof," I said, sliding a folder across the table. "Take a look for yourself." He didn't touch it. Instead, he glared at me, his jaw tight. "This is low, even for you," he said. "Low?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You're the one who's trying to destroy my reputation and tear this family apart. And for what? To pay off your debts?" His eyes widened slightly, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. "That's right," I said. "I know about the loans, Avery. I know how much you and Mia owe. This isn't about Dad's decision. This is about money. You're desperate, and you're willing to burn everything down to get what you want." "You don't know anything," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "I know enough," I said. "And if you keep pushing this, I'll make sure everyone else knows, too." For a moment, I thought he might back down, but the look in his eyes told me otherwise. Avery wasn't going to stop. If anything, my confrontation had only made him more determined. The next day, I got a call from Jackson. "We've got a problem," he said. "Avery's filed a formal request for an injunction. He's trying to freeze the estate until the legal dispute is resolved." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It means you won't have access to the business until the court makes a decision," Jackson said. "If the injunction is granted, it could take months, maybe even years, to resolve." I hung up, my heart pounding. Avery wasn't just trying to win the case. He was trying to bleed me dry, to make it impossible for me to fight back. The tipping point came at a family dinner Mom insisted on hosting. She wanted to clear the air, as she put it. But as soon as we were all seated, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. "You've gone too far, Avery," Dad said, his voice cold. "This isn't about fairness anymore. This is about you being selfish." "Selfish?" Avery shot back. "I'm selfish for wanting what's mine?" "It's not yours," Dad said firmly. "It never was." The argument escalated quickly, voices rising as accusations flew across the table. Mom tried to mediate, but her pleas for calm were drowned out by the shouting. The final blow came when Avery turned to me, his face twisted with rage. "You've always been the favorite," he said. "You've always had everything handed to you. Well, not this time. I'm going to fight you every step of the way, and I'm going to win." I stood up, my hands shaking. "If you want to fight, Avery, you've got one. But don't think for a second that you're going to walk away from this unscathed." As I left the house that night, I knew there was no going back. The battle lines had been drawn, and the stakes were higher than ever. The fallout from that family dinner was immediate. Mom called me the next morning, her voice trembling with worry. "Hunter," she said, "I can't take this anymore. The fighting, the accusations. It's tearing us apart." "I know, Mom," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though I wasn't sure how much reassurance I could offer. "But Avery's the one doing this. He won't let it go. There has to be a way to fix this," she said, her voice breaking. "You're brothers. You're supposed to protect each other, not destroy each other." Her words hit me harder than I expected, but the anger I felt toward Avery burned brighter than my guilt. "I've tried reasoning with him," I said, "but he's made his choice. Now I have to protect what Dad built, and myself." Mom fell silent for a moment before whispering, "I'm scared of what this is going to do to our family." I didn't know how to respond because, deep down, I was scared too. The legal battle escalated faster than I expected. Avery's injunction request was granted, freezing the estate and effectively locking me out of the business until the dispute was resolved. Worse, he began leveraging the court's decision as proof that there was merit to his claims. Family members who had been on the fence started leaning toward his side, convinced that he wouldn't have gotten this far without evidence. Sophia, thankfully, stood firmly by me. One night, she came over with a bottle of wine and a folder of research she'd been compiling on Avery's and Mia's recent behavior. "You're going to need this," she said, dropping the folder onto the kitchen counter. "Avery's not playing fair, so neither should you." I opened the folder and was immediately struck by what she'd found. Phone records, bank statements, and even social media posts painted a damning picture of Mia's involvement. There were cryptic messages between Mia and an unknown third party discussing contingencies and payments. More concerning were large cash withdrawals from Avery's account, amounts he couldn't possibly afford, given his debt. "This is gold, Soph," I said, flipping through the documents. "How did you get all this?" She grinned. "Let's just say I've got friends who don't mind bending the rules for a good cause." Her determination lifted my spirits, but it also reminded me how far this feud had gone. We weren't just fighting over money or a business anymore. We were fighting for survival. The next major confrontation came during a scheduled deposition. Both Avery and I were required to attend, along with our legal teams. It was the first time we'd been face-to-face since the disastrous dinner, and the tension in the room was palpable. Avery's lawyer wasted no time laying out their case. He painted me as a manipulative opportunist who had taken advantage of Dad's declining health to secure the lion's share of the inheritance. He even brought up old emails between Dad and me, twisting innocent discussions about the business into something sinister. When it was my turn to respond, my lawyer, Jackson, dismantled their arguments piece by piece. He presented evidence of my contributions to the company and highlighted Dad's clear and deliberate reasoning for his decision. But the real blow came when Jackson introduced Sophia's findings. "These financial records," Jackson said, holding up copies of Mia's bank statements, "suggest a coordinated effort to siphon funds from Mr. Avery's account. Moreover, the correspondence between Mia and an unknown third party raises serious questions about her motives." Avery's face turned red as Jackson continued to lay out the evidence. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But Mia, seated beside him, looked unfazed. She leaned over and whispered something in his ear, and whatever she said seemed to reinvigorate him. By the end of the deposition, it was clear that neither side was willing to back down. The strain on the family only grew as the case dragged on. Dad tried to stay neutral, but his frustration with Avery was becoming harder to hide. Mom, meanwhile, was growing increasingly desperate to broker peace. One evening, she called a meeting at their house, insisting that we all attend. When I arrived, I found Avery and Mia already there, seated on one side of the living room, while Sophia sat on the other. The divide was literal. "Thank you all for coming," Mom said, her voice trembling. "We need to put an end to this before it destroys us." "There's nothing to end," Avery said coolly. "I'm fighting for what's mine. If Hunter wants to avoid this mess, he can step aside." "I'm not stepping aside," I said firmly. "You're the one dragging this out, Avery. All because you can't accept that Dad made his decision." "You mean your decision?" Avery shot back. "Don't act like you didn't manipulate him into giving you the business." "Enough." Dad's voice cut through the room like a thunderclap. "I've had it with this nonsense. Hunter didn't manipulate me. I gave him the business because he earned it. If you can't accept that, Avery, that's your problem. But don't you dare accuse your brother of something he didn't do." Avery looked stunned for a moment, but then his expression hardened. "You're just as blind as he is," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You always have been." Mia placed a hand on his arm, whispering something to him, but this time it seemed to have the opposite effect. He shrugged her off, his face a mask of fury. "Maybe you should stay out of this," he snapped at her. The room fell silent. Mia's eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing. For the first time, I wondered if the cracks in their partnership were starting to show. A few days later, I got a call from Emma. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "Mia's been reaching out to lawyers. Divorce lawyers." "Divorce?" I repeated, confused. "She and Avery aren't married." "Not legally, no," Emma said. "But she's claiming they have a common-law marriage, and she's preparing to file a claim for half of everything he owns." My jaw dropped. "Are you serious?" "As a heart attack," Emma said. "It looks like she's trying to cut her losses and take what she can before this blows up in her face." The irony of it all was almost too much to process. Mia, the woman who had been Avery's biggest ally in this fight, was now planning to turn on him. And if she succeeded, it could leave Avery with nothing. The final blow came during a court hearing a week later. Mia's betrayal had thrown Avery off balance, and it showed in his demeanor. He was no longer the confident, determined brother I'd been fighting. He looked defeated, like a man who had realized he'd been playing a losing game from the start. During the hearing, my lawyer presented new evidence tying Mia to fraudulent activities in her previous relationships. It was damning enough to make the judge question Avery's entire case. By the end of the day, it was clear which way the ruling would go. Avery avoided my eyes as we left the courtroom, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity for him, but it was quickly overshadowed by the relief of knowing the worst was over. The fallout from the court hearing was swift and brutal. Avery's case was officially dismissed, and the judge ruled in favor of upholding Dad's estate plan. The business was mine, as Dad had intended all along, but the victory felt hollow. Avery didn't show up for the final ruling. According to Sophia, he'd been keeping a low profile since the last hearing. Word had gotten around about Mia's betrayal, and everyone in the family seemed to know the gist of what had happened. Avery had trusted the wrong person, and it had cost him everything. For weeks, he ignored my calls and texts. Despite everything he'd done, I wanted to talk to him, to try and find some way to salvage our relationship. But he wasn't interested. It was Sophia who eventually told me the full story. She'd gone to see Avery a few days after the ruling, finding him in the small apartment he'd moved into after leaving Mia. "He's a mess, Hunter," she said when she called me afterward. Mia drained what was left of his savings and ran. "He's drowning in debt, and he's too proud to ask for help." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Do you think he'd even listen if I reached out?" "I don't know," she said. "He's angry, but I think it's more at himself than at you." I wanted to believe that, but the bitterness Avery had shown throughout this ordeal made it hard to be optimistic. The family, meanwhile, was in shambles. Mom had fallen into a deep depression, blaming herself for not stopping the feud before it got out of hand. Dad tried to keep things together, but the stress was wearing on him. "It's like I've lost both of my sons," he said to me one night when I stopped by to check on him. "You haven't lost me, Dad," I said. "And you haven't lost Avery either. He just needs time." "I hope you're right," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. A month later, I got an unexpected knock on my door. When I opened it, Avery was standing there, looking like a shadow of his former self. He'd lost weight, and his usually confident demeanor was replaced by a quiet weariness. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. We sat at the kitchen table in awkward silence for a moment before he finally spoke. "I screwed up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I let my pride, my anger, everything get in the way. And now I've got nothing to show for it." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lay into him, to list every way he'd wronged me and the family. But looking at him now, I realized he didn't need me to. He already knew. "I don't know if I can fix things," he continued, his eyes downcast. "But I had to come here. I had to tell you I'm sorry." Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For so long, I'd been carrying the anger and betrayal like a shield, but in that moment, I realized how much I wanted to move past it. "I'm sorry too," I said finally, "for not seeing how much you were struggling, for not being a better brother." Avery looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You didn't do anything wrong, Hunter. This was all me." It wasn't a perfect resolution. The wounds left by our feud would take time to heal, and some scars would never fade. But that conversation was a start, a chance to rebuild what we'd nearly destroyed. Over the next few months, things began to settle. Avery found a job in a neighboring city, working as a property manager for a small real estate firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it gave him a chance to rebuild his life. Mia, on the other hand, disappeared completely. The last I heard, she was involved in another legal dispute with a different family. Part of me felt sorry for her, but mostly, I was relieved she was out of our lives. The business continued to thrive, though running it without the shadow of the legal battle felt strangely surreal. For so long, I'd been focused on defending my right to the company that I hadn't thought about what it would mean to simply run it. Sophia, as always, was my rock. She stayed close, helping to patch up the rifts within the family. Dad slowly began to forgive Avery, though it took longer for him to forgive himself for the role he believed he'd played in our conflict. Mom, however, remained distant. The fight had taken a toll on her, and while she never said it outright, I could tell she blamed herself for not keeping the peace. Looking back, I'm not sure if there's a lesson to be learned from all of this. Family is complicated, messy, and sometimes painful. We hurt the people we love, even when we don't mean to, or maybe especially when we do. But if there's one thing I've come to realize, it's that family isn't just about blood. It's about the choices we make every day. The choice to fight for each other, to forgive, to keep showing up even when it's hard. Avery and I aren't the same as we were before all of this. Maybe we never will be, but we're trying. And for now, that's enough.